pay attention. The more you pay attention, the less studying you'll have to do. All right, so I'm going to talk about the exam in general. I've already mentioned when it is. I know people are still setting up their phones, so I'm not going to get right into the point-worthy stuff yet. But be here at 10, Scantron, eraser, pencil, number 2 pencil. Once you're finished, I'd like you to step out of the room until everybody's done, and then we'll come back in. We'll have our lab exam review. There'll be no new lab on Tuesday. And I should have microscopes over there with some of the more important slides on them set up, but we'll see if I get time to do that. So the written part of the exam will be first this time, and that's just under a third of the exam. Then the rest of it's going to be Scantron-based, multiple choice, and true-false. Now, some of the things I mentioned already, and it's nothing new here, were the 5 Darwin statements. And I said to write down the 5 Darwin statements. And I gave them to you 2 weeks ago so that you had time to start memorizing them. And I want you to write them down in order, the order I gave them to you. And if you just memorize them word for word or close, you're guaranteed to get all 5 points. If you try to put them in your own words, and I read them and you've done a good job, you'll get the 5 points. But if you leave something off, I'm only going to give you partial credit. If you try to just make stuff up, that won't get you any points. Some students do end up doing that. And after you put them down in order, starting with more are born than will survive and reproduce, and ending with vast spans of time have been available for evolution. Then the next part is 5 matching questions. So number 1, more are born than survive and reproduce. I might say down below something like an insect produces far more eggs than the number of young who will survive to adulthood. That would go, and I'd say, which of the 5 Darwin statements does that best go with? And then you'd put number 1 next to that. I might say something about sexual reproduction or heritability, passing on traits to offspring. Well, that would go with number 4 about heritability. If I said something about life has been on Earth for over 3 billion years, that would go with vast spans of time, number 5. Sometimes students use the matching to try and recreate the Darwin statements because they didn't learn them. It's not going to work. It never does, but I guess if you're desperate, you might as well try. I would prefer that I wouldn't prefer this. It's easier to grade blank pages, but for your sake, I hope that if you don't know the answer to a question, you'll at least take a stab at it. Because if you guess even partially correct, I'll give you partial credit. Okay, so that's the 5 Darwin statements. There's also the 5 Hardy-Weinberg assumptions, and then 5 matching questions after those. The Hardy-Weinberg assumptions don't have to be in any particular order. So no natural selection, no gene flow, large population size, random mating, and I forget the other one. It doesn't matter. You know the ones I'm talking about. I guess no mutation if I didn't say that. And in any case, those can be in any order, and then I'll have some statements below, and you'll match the number. Like if you put no natural selection is number 1, then the statement that relates to natural selection, I might talk about praying mantises that look like leaves are less seen by predators. Well, that would be natural selection, so that would go with the no natural selection assumption. That's the matching part. Please, if you put the Darwin ones in the Hardy-Weinberg question, that's all wrong. There's no partial credit. If you put the Hardy-Weinberg ones in the Darwin section, I use Hardy-Weinberg and Darwin's name in the question. But some students don't read the question carefully and they just start writing. And they put the wrong ones in the wrong place and they wonder what their problem is. Why isn't this working? So, if you do that, I can't give you any points because that's too big a mistake. And if you put natural selection instead of no natural selection, that's not partial credit, because natural selection would be the opposite of no natural selection. So forgetting which ones say no, or large population size. If you put small population size, that's the opposite of the assumption. And I can't give partial credit for something that's the opposite of the truth. All right, so that's going to be 20 points on the written section. That's over half of it. Differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes I've mentioned over and over again. Make sure, I said make sure and be comfortable with at least 4 of them. And make sure and give me what eukaryotes and prokaryotes both have or don't have. Cell theory, you're going to be asked to write down the parts of the cell theory. There's 2 parts to it. You should review that and be able to write, all creatures are made of 1 or more cells. If you just put cells, that's half point off. You got to say 1 or more, so I know you understand there's unicellular life. All creatures, or all cells, come from the division of pre-existing cells. I was grading some things yesterday. People were putting they were using words like reproduction instead of division. You know, division is the word. Reproduction doesn't mean cell division. It can, but there's plenty of other ways to reproduce. So, you know, use the words more carefully. I didn't take points off that time, but I wouldn't on the test. Okay, also I mentioned Lamarck. I said either know the 2 things he got right or the 2 flaws, the 2 things he got wrong, and be able to write those down. I mentioned the order of the taxa: domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So be sure that you can write them down. If you don't spell them perfectly, as long as you're close, you'll be fine. Although I'm not sure which of those words you might have trouble with spelling. Open system, remember what they exchange with the environment. It's got to be exactly what's in the notes, because if you give something else, it's likely not to be a complete answer. Some people put things like oxygen and CO2, but that's totally wrong. Open systems exchange a lot more than oxygen and CO2 with the environment. Okay, there's also the section on the matter cycles. As I said during lecture, a bunch of fill in the blank and circle the right answer questions. Make sure you know what fixed nitrogen is. That's ammonia. You can write down the word ammonia or NH3, the chemical formula. And then unfixed nitrogen, completely unfixed nitrogen is N2, or atmospheric nitrogen. Partially unfixed is the nitrate and the nitrite. They're not likely to be in this section. Remember that nitrogen fixation is made by reduction, which means you're adding electrons, which means you're adding energy. And the molecule you get from this nitrogen fixation is going to be a high energy molecule compared to unfixed atmospheric nitrogen. So I'll ask for the fixed form. Is that oxidation or reduction that makes it? Is that high or low energy, the fixed form? And it's high. And then the process that fixes nitrogen is called nitrogen fixation. Not unfixed nitrogen is, say, atmospheric nitrogen, and that's made by oxidation, removing energy. That's going to make unfixed nitrogen a low energy molecule. And the process that makes completely unfixed nitrogen is denitrification. The one that partially unfixes it and brings it down in energy is called nitrification. For the carbon cycle, fixed carbon is glucose, unfixed is CO2. The process that fixes carbon is photosynthesis, and it's reduction, and it's going to make high energy carbon, that's glucose. And then to unfix carbon is to oxidize it, to remove energy from it, and produce low energy carbon dioxide. And the process that does this is cellular respiration. Okay, so that's the section, as I said, fill in the blank and circle the correct answer. Next is the rest of the test, which is multiple choice, true, false, mostly multiple choice. Remember, an adaptation is anything about your the way you live or characteristics you have, like thick fur, or different digestive system to handle a new food source, like more meat, or even a behavior, learning to, like the woodpecker finch from Darwin's study that picked up a twig to pry insects out of cracks and branches. That they're all adaptations. Anything that's going to help increase your chances of survival. And that's because nature is selecting in favor of some adaptations, like thick fur in a cold climate, and against others, like thin fur in a cold climate. And so that's natural selection, working on those different adaptations. The best adaptations for that natural environment are going to be the ones held by the survivors. The survivors are going to get to pass those on. Darwin says the environment is what does natural selection. Remember from our evolution discussion that creatures that are much different from each other end up looking similar or having similar characteristics if they live in similar environments, and that's called convergent evolution. Remember in our discussion that was one of our evidences for evolution. Another was that vestigial structures exist. These are structures that are no longer being used and are slowly disappearing over time. And that supports evolution, and the idea is that characteristics that you tend to use will be passed on. Characteristics that you don't use will not be passed on, because life tends to want to save energy and not make things that are unnecessary. I mentioned about pro and eukaryotes both using flagella to move. That's one commonality between the two. Otherwise, they don't use similar ways of moving. I also mentioned that both pro and eukaryotes they have photosynthetic membranes, thylakoid membranes, that can help that allow photosynthesis to occur. Okay, so remember to think carefully about the meaning of natural selection, because I'll ask about it in a couple different ways. Early on in the class, I talked about how life began with prokaryotes that were heterotrophs, and then we had photoautotrophs, so cyanobacteria, and then the first eukaryotes, and then the first multicellular eukaryotes, and then animals, and then plants. That order is going to be wrong 4 times and correct 1 time on a multiple choice question. You'll be asked to pick the correct order. Now, remember, these adaptations are going to help you survive and reproduce better. That's the main thing about adaptations, the good ones, the ones that the environment favors. Remember, the gene pool is all the genes or alleles within a population. That comes from our microevolution lecture. Remember our definitions of species. And a species has they can mate with members of the same species and produce viable fertile offspring. There's some other things I said, like if you mate outside your species, you may not get anything at all, or you may get an inviable offspring, or a sterile offspring, or an offspring that'll break down, have this hybrid breakdown. And that you can't mate with members outside of your species. But remember, even though they're species, they're all similar genetically, but they're not identical. That's because of genetic variation. I talked about homologous structures, where our arm, the wing of a bat, the flipper of a porpoise or a dolphin, and the leg of a reptile ancestor all have similar bones in them because they're homologous structures. They come from the same ancient body part, the front limb of a reptile. But as evolution takes place, they're modified into new structures for new uses in new environments. And so that was all about homologous structures. They're derived from the same body part, but they don't look the same anymore because they've been modified by evolution. Remember, evolution that is a geographic isolation, or speciation caused by isolation geographically is called allopatric, different country. Remember, if you have a species form in the same place, that's called sympatric speciation. And I tried to give you some examples how that might happen last time. Remember, the ecological species concept describes a species based on, or defines a species based on the resources it uses. If you see the word resources, think ecological species concept. The biological species concept is the classic, able to mate and produce viable fertile offspring, and will do so in nature. It's not something they'll do with force, but they'll do it in nature and produce viable fertile offspring. That definition, you should know that one as well. Any mechanism that prevents you from forming a fertilized egg is called prezygotic. I'll ask about that. Any mechanism that isolates populations or isolates species from each other, but you can still get a zygote and then maybe like a mule, something that lives but can't reproduce. That's a post-zygotic mechanism. Specifically, that was hybrid sterility. Remember Wallace and Darwin came up with the same idea. So if I ask you about what's the driving force, what causes evolution, or what causes evolution, it's natural selection in Darwin's theory, but it's also natural selection in Wallace's theory. Lamarck, on the other hand, said that the reason species evolve is because of an internal drive towards perfection, which has never been shown to exist. Remember that microevolution is a change in gene frequencies in a population, and it's got to be statistically significant. Remember genetic drift, when we talked about Hardy and Weinberg, genetic drift was the small population, small sample size, like flipping a coin 10 times isn't always going to give you 5 heads and 5 tails. Flipping a coin 10,000 times is going to give you 5,000 heads, 5,000 tails, very close to it. And so that's part of genetic drift and the problem with small population size. Another way of defining natural selection is to call it differential reproductive success. That is, some do better and some do worse at reproducing because they're better suited to the environment. Let's see here, isolating mechanism, sterile hybrids, remember that is called, I just said it, it's called hybrid sterility. And it's also post-zygotic. I said you could form viable fertile offspring, but they're not as fit as either parent species, like the lion and tiger example. That would be hybrid breakdown, where the hybrid comes out less fit usually, and that keeps the species from merging together into one. Remember who's our ancestors, bacteria or archaea. We're more closely related to archaea than bacteria. Remember the different nutritional categories like photoautotrophs, chemolithoautotrophs, and chemoheterotrophs. There was one more in that part of the notes, but I said it wouldn't be on the test. And you should remember which one of those groups we are in. There was also a couple multiple choice questions about the nitrogen cycle, because the family of fill in the blank questions and such on the written section is not worth very many points. And it's such an important topic that I wanted to add a few points by giving you a few more questions on the regular part of the test. It's important to remember that reduction is often going to add energy and oxidation is going to often remove energy. Remember punctuated equilibrium, rapid evolutionary change, periods of little or no change punctuated by periods of rapid evolutionary change, versus gradualism, which was slow, steady change. That was from Tuesday's lecture. Remember temporal isolation, sexually mature at different times of years, geographic isolation or habitat isolation, you're in different places so you can't mate. Let's see, what else do we have? Well, I think those are the major ones. If I come up with any more, I'll let you know. Remember endosymbiosis, where a prokaryote is engulfed by a larger cell, a larger eukaryote, and then becomes an organelle. And that would be primary endosymbiosis. If a eukaryote is engulfed by a eukaryote and that becomes an organelle, that would be secondary endosymbiosis. For the different protists, remember just the factoids I gave you in the last lecture and a little bit today, like dysentery for amoeba, sleeping sickness for trypanosoma, and malaria, dysentery for amoeba, malaria for plasmodium. And then things like kelp is a brown algae, green algae, the ancestors of plants, choanoflagellates are most closely related to the ancestor of animals. I could go on and on, but all those different facts I talked about. Remember the different things I discussed with bacteria. If you're aerobic, you can live in oxygen. If you're obligate anaerobe, you can't stand oxygen, you can't live in oxygen, or at least normal levels of oxygen. You might live with a tiny bit, but not the normal amount. Remember, facultative anaerobes can live in both oxygen and non-oxygen environments. So look over that section. Remember the order, the stages of how life might have appeared on Earth. First was to make the building blocks like amino acids and nucleotides. Second was to make biomolecules. Third was to add membrane around them. And fourth was for the membrane plus biomolecules to take on some of the properties of life. And I'll have them in order wrong 3 times or 4 times and then correct 1 time, and you pick the correct order. I mentioned during the nitrogen cycle that some plants can't use ammonia. Some can, many can, but some can't. And they need these nitrifying bacteria to turn it into nitrate or nitrite. So making nitrogen available to plants by turning ammonia into nitrate, that would be nitrification. Because again, some plants can't use the ammonia as is. Remember, bacteria can transfer DNA by conjugation from one to another. And that can give a little variation, but the most important mechanism for variation, or way that bacteria get variation, prokaryotes in general, is through mutation. And I went through an example of how that would work. Remember, alternation of generations is separate haploid and diploid multicellular life stages, multicellular haploids, multicellular diploids. Remember that archaea have pseudomurine in their walls. Green algae have cellulose in their walls, fungi have chitin, and bacteria have peptidoglycan. I listed them in the section on bacteria. I listed all 4 of them there, and then since then I've talked about algae having cellulose, green ones anyway. You learned that in lab too. And then the fungi today with their chitinous cell walls, chitin. Remember that the reason we have so much oxygen in the air is because of photosynthesis. So photoautotrophs, that's why we have it. Without photoautotrophs, there wouldn't be oxygen. Certainly we wouldn't exist. Remember all the important roles of bacteria. I mentioned how they are the nitrogen cycle. Nobody else does it but them. They're, along with fungi, the most important decomposers. Everything that does the carbon cycle is either bacteria or organelles that used to be bacteria, so they're important there. Of course, they also cause disease. Remember, disease-causing bacteria known as pathogens. Patho for disease, gen means generate or create. Remember the thermoacidophiles, the geysers and hot springs, the halophiles were in the very salty waters, and the methanogens were in no oxygen environments and produce methane. Remember, monophyletic is the kind of classification we like to do. Polyphyletic, paraphyletic, they're not what we want. They would be wrong answers, I said. Monophyletic is you have an ancestor and all of its descendants. That's the kind of classification we'd like to do. Getting back to Miller and Urey, I haven't talked about them yet, but I did talk about that chapter. Miller and Urey experiment was not exactly like the conditions of the early Earth. And we still don't know exactly what those conditions are, but we think we have a better idea. And the key to Miller and Urey wasn't what they actually did, was that they showed us how to do an experiment. And when we put the more chemicals we think more likely on Earth, we still get biomolecules forming. So Miller and Urey did not get it exactly right, but they did an experiment that led us to get closer to the truth. Okay, bacteria, I've already mentioned how they move with flagella, but they don't use cilia, pseudopods, or anything else because that's all eukaryotic stuff. Some of the personality questions are showing up. Remember, Kingdom Protista is not a kingdom anymore. If I refer to Kingdom Protista, it's automatically false. But the reason it was abolished and gotten rid of is because it's so far from monophyletic, it's just not close at all. And Plant Kingdom's pretty close, so we like that one. Protista was way too far from being monophyletic, so it was abolished. So it's not, of course, monophyletic. Also remember, we can accurately date fossils within a few percentage points of how old they are. For personalities, remember, Lyell was uniformitarianism. He said that geological processes have been the same throughout the history of Earth. Hutton said they were slow and gradual, and then Lyell said, yeah, they are now, and they always have been. So uniformitarianism goes with Lyell, and this kind of gradualism goes with Hutton. Remember that Cuvier was the fossil guy, and he was the first one to realize that deeper fossils are older, and fossils closer to the surface are newer. And he did not agree with evolution. That doesn't matter for the test, though. Remember that Darwin got the idea of more being born than will survive from the economist, mathematician known as Malthus. Remember that, we're pretty much out of those guys. Remember that Wallace and Darwin both proposed, so if I have a multiple choice question, who came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection? If you see Darwin and Wallace, you got to pick the answer that allows you to choose both of them. If you just see Darwin, choose Darwin. If you just see Wallace, choose Wallace. But we want to remember that he came up with the idea too. There might be one or two more of those personality questions in my notes here, but I'm going to move on. More protist questions. Remember, photosynthesizers with silica shells are going to be diatoms. If they're heterotrophs with silica shells or tests, they're radiolarians. Remember, for bioluminescence, symbiosis with coral, red tides, all of that goes with dinoflagellates. Excuse me. Dinoflagellates. I already mentioned the diseases by Plasmodium, Trypanosoma, and amoeba, some of those. Remember, if you get genetic drift from a disaster that kills most of your population, that's called the bottleneck effect. If you get genetic drift by taking a sort of an unrepresentative sample from a population and moving it to a new place, nobody dies in this scenario, that's called the founder effect. They're both reducing populations, but through two different mechanisms. And founder and bottleneck are both found in future classes, and that's why they're in our exam. Remember, fungi are all heterotrophs. They all have cell walls of chitin. And the basic unit of a fungus is the hypha, and a mass of those units that help the thing collect food is going to be a mycelium. I'm going to describe some symbioses like dinoflagellates in coral or mycorrhizae from today. But if I describe any disease, that's also symbiosis. It's just not mutually beneficial. So mutualism will be a type of symbiosis, but so would parasitism. So if I give you some examples that include a disease, that is also symbiosis. It's a type of symbiotic. It's just not the kind people commonly think about. Remember, 2 haploid nuclei are dikaryotic, and you've undergone plasmogamy. If you have 1 diploid nucleus, you've undergone karyogamy from today's lecture. Remember, if I ask you which personality came up with the idea of creating a model theoretical population that's not evolving, I could say either Hardy or Weinberg, because they both had that idea. Remember that plant or cell walls or bacterial cell walls, they're all going to protect the cell from bursting when you put it in a hypotonic solution. It's got to be the more watery solution outside. So water flows in, increases pressure, causes animal cells to burst, but the wall won't let these burst. If I say something like putting it in an isotonic or hypertonic solution, that's not going to cause water to flow in, and that's not what a wall is for. And that would be false if I said those. If I say hypo, it's true. Hyper, if the solution outside is hypo, walls protect from lysis. But if it's hyper or iso, walls don't protect from lysis, because lysis isn't going to happen. Remember parabasalids helping termites digest wood. Remember who are mixotrophs and what mixotrophs mean. And remember which type of disease causer changes its surface proteins over its short generation, so our immune system is always out of date. That's one of the 3 disease causers. Talked about pretty much every question on the exam now. You're welcome to come get your phones. I'm going to take 10. If you want to start working on the lab,